May 1945. A makeshift Allied prisoner of war camp somewhere in the British-occupied zone of northern Germany. The war is over. The silence feels heavier than the gunfire ever did. Rows of wooden barracks stretch beneath a gray sky. Barbed wire sags between hastily planted posts. Inside the wire, hundreds of women wait, exhausted, hollow-eyed, dressed in faded Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms or civilian clothes stained with the dust of collapse. At the camp's main gate, 3 British officers stand beside a convoy of trucks, engines idle. The trucks are bound for the Soviet occupation zone, part of the repatriation agreement signed in the rubble of Berlin. One by one, names are called. No one moves. The officers call again. Louder this time. Still, the women remain motionless, clutching their few belongings, staring at the ground. A young captain steps forward, confused, frustrated. "You're free to go home," he says in broken German. A woman near the front, no older than 25, finally speaks. Her voice is calm, but her hands shake. "We cannot go east," the officer doesn't understand. "These are prisoners. Prisoners want to go home, but these women are refusing freedom. And the reason, when it finally emerges, will force Allied commanders to confront a truth darker and more complex than any battlefield they've known. To understand why these women refuse to leave, we must step back into the machinery of Nazi Germany and the roles women played within it. By 1943, the Third Reich was bleeding. Millions of men had been swallowed by the Eastern Front. The factories, the farms, the defense networks, all demanded bodies. And so the regime turned to its women. They were called Blitzmädchen, lightning girls, recruited into the Wehrmacht auxiliary services. They operated anti-aircraft batteries, manned telephone exchanges, decoded signals, and kept the logistical arteries of war pumping. Others served as concentration camp guards, nurses in military hospitals, or clerks in occupation administrations. By 1945, over 500,000 German women wore some form of military or paramilitary uniform. Most were volunteers. Some were ideologically fervent. Others simply sought food, shelter, or escape from bombed-out cities. The line between victim and participant blurred in the gray fog of total war. Then came April 1945. The Red Army smashed through the Oder River. American and British forces swept across the Rhine. Germany fractured. Entire Wehrmacht divisions disintegrated. Refugees clogged the roads, fleeing west, away from the Soviets. The women in uniform fled too. They tore off their insignia, buried their papers, tried to blend into the chaos. But many were caught, rounded up by British, American, or Soviet patrols as the Reich collapsed into rubble and ash. Under the terms of the Yalta Conference, all Soviet citizens and nationals from territories occupied by the USSR were to be repatriated. This included ethnic Germans from the Eastern Territories, Poles, Ukrainians, and anyone captured in Soviet-designated zones. The Allies assumed the process would be straightforward. Former enemies would go home. Camps would be emptied. Order would be restored. But in camps across Germany, something unexpected began to happen. Women, thousands of them, refused to board the trains heading east. The Allied commanders were unprepared for this resistance. In the British and American zones, Paru camps swelled with surrendered German forces. Men, women, elderly Volkssturm volunteers, even teenagers. Processing them was a logistical nightmare. Millions needed to be fed, housed, documented, and eventually sent home. The policy was clear: repatriate quickly, avoid long-term burden, let Germany sort itself out under occupation law. For male soldiers, the process moved slowly but predictably. Most accepted their fate. They had fought, they had lost, and now they would return to whatever remained of their homes. But the women were different. in camps near Lübeck, Hanover, and Brunswick, British officers reported the same troubling pattern. Women scheduled for transport east would refuse to assemble. Some staged sit-ins. Others wept openly, begging guards not to put them on the trains. A few attempted self-harm. At first, the officers thought it was simple fear of punishment. These women had served the Nazi regime after all. Perhaps they expected tribunals, imprisonment, harsh justice. But as interpreters translated their pleas, a darker picture emerged. They were not afraid of tribunals. They were afraid of the Red Army. Stories had spread like wildfire through the camps, stories carried by refugees who had fled the Eastern territories. Stories of Soviet soldiers exacting vengeance on German women. Mass rapes in East Prussia, Silesia, Pomerania. Villages where every female between 12 and 60 had been assaulted. Entire towns emptied by terror. Some of these stories were propaganda, exaggerated by Goebbels' final broadcasts to stiffen German resistance. But many were true. Soviet archives and survivor testimonies would later confirm the scale. An estimated 2 million German women assaulted during the Red Army's advance and occupation. The women in the camps knew this. They had heard the testimonies. Some had witnessed it themselves before capture, and now the Allies were preparing to send them directly into Soviet hands. The officers faced an impossible dilemma. Orders were orders. Repatriation agreements had been signed at the highest levels. The Soviets demanded their prisoners back. No exceptions. But looking into the faces of these women, some barely out of their teens, the commanders began to understand. This was not refusal of punishment. This was refusal of annihilation. The fear was not abstract. It was visceral, rooted in experience and the testimony of those who had barely escaped. One woman, a former signals operator named Greta, had fled from Königsberg in January 1945. She described the journey to a British intelligence officer during her interrogation. Frozen roads, columns of refugees machine-gunned from the air, villages burning on the horizon, and everywhere the knowledge of what awaited those who couldn't run fast enough. She had seen women pulled from refugee columns by Soviet advance units. She had heard the screams echoing from farmhouses at night. When she finally reached the British lines in early May, she surrendered willingly, grateful even. The British represented safety. Now they wanted to send her back. "You don't understand," she told the interpreter, her voice flat with exhaustion. "If you send us east, we are dead. Maybe not immediately, but we are dead." For women who had served in Wehrmacht auxiliary roles near the Eastern Front, the fear was even more acute. Anti-aircraft batteries, communications hubs, logistics centers, these had been legitimate military targets. The Soviets considered anyone in uniform complicit in the invasion of their homeland, the siege of Leningrad, the scorched earth retreat. Soviet policy toward captured German women was inconsistent and often brutal. Some were sent to labor camps in the Urals or Siberia. Others were processed through filtration camps where conditions rivaled the worst of the Nazi system. Sexual violence was systematic, often tacitly approved by officers as a form of collective revenge. The women in the Allied camps had no illusions. They had served the regime that invaded the Soviet Union, killed 27 million Soviet citizens, and left entire regions in ruins. They knew what vengeance looked like, but many had not volunteered out of ideology. They had been conscripted under the total mobilization laws of 1943 and 1944. Refusal meant prison or worse. Service meant survival, until survival itself became a crime. In the camps, the women formed tight networks. They shared intelligence, warned each other of upcoming transports, and strategized resistance. Some bribed guards with hidden jewelry or watches. Others claimed false identities, pretending to be from Western German regions outside Soviet jurisdiction. A British chaplain assigned to one camp wrote in his diary, "These women are more afraid of liberation than they ever were of captivity. What does it say about our victory when the defeated beg us not to set them free? The question haunted the camps. The Allies had fought to defeat fascism, to restore justice and humanity to a shattered continent. But the mechanisms of that victory, the alliances forged, the territories divided, had created new horrors. And now, in the spring of 1945, those horrors had faces. They stood behind barbed wire, silent and terrified, watching the trucks that would carry them east. But the commanders faced another truth, one that complicated every decision. Not all of these women were innocent. Among the prisoners refusing repatriation were former concentration camp guards, women who had served at Ravensbrück, Bergen-Belsen, Auschwitz-Birkenau, women who had beaten inmates, selected victims for medical experiments, or stood watch as thousands died from starvation and disease. British intelligence officers sifted through the records. They cross-referenced names with survivor testimonies. Some of the women pleading for mercy had themselves shown none. One case haunted the camp administrators. A woman named Ilse had served as an Aufseherin, a female overseer, at a labor camp in occupied Poland. Witnesses identified her as particularly cruel, known for using a riding crop on prisoners too weak to work. She was 23 years old. When informed she would be turned over to Soviet or Polish authorities for trial, she attempted suicide. Guards found her in time. Her defense was simple. "I was following orders. I had no choice." The same defense thousands of others would use in the coming years. The question gnawed at the Allied officers. Did complicity in atrocity eliminate the right to protection from atrocity? If these women were sent east, many would face summary execution or years in brutal captivity. Soviet justice was swift and merciless. The legal processes Western powers would later establish at Nuremberg did not yet exist in the chaos of May 1945, but neither could the Allies simply release them. Public opinion back home demanded justice. Newsreels had shown the liberated camps, the skeletal survivors, the mass graves, the gas chambers. The world wanted accountability. Yet standing in those POW camps, looking at exhausted young women who had served a monstrous regime, the line between justice and revenge seemed impossibly thin. Some commanders argued for a middle path: separate those with documented evidence of war crimes from ordinary auxiliaries, send the guilty to proper tribunals, allow the others to remain in Western zones. But the Soviets rejected any such distinction. To them, every German who had served the Wehrmacht apparatus bore responsibility for the invasion and occupation of Soviet territory. The distinction between typing reports and pulling triggers was meaningless when 27 million of your people were dead. The political pressure was immense. Stalin demanded full compliance with Yalta agreements. Any deviation risked fracturing the fragile alliance that had won the war. British and American officers found themselves caught between legal obligations, moral instincts, and geopolitical necessity. Some chose to delay. Transports were postponed due to administrative complications. Paperwork went missing. Women were quietly transferred between camps, their records becoming harder to trace. Others followed orders to the letter, loading women onto trains despite their screams and pleas, haunted by the duty they performed. One American officer wrote to his wife, "We saved Europe from tyranny, only to deliver some of its people to another form of it. I pray history judges us more kindly than I judge myself." The moral paradox was complete. These women had served evil. Some had committed evil. But the justice awaiting them in the East was itself a form of evil. And in that gray space, between victim and perpetrator, between justice and vengeance, commanders had to make choices that would echo for decades. June 1945, a camp outside Hanover. The order had come down from Allied headquarters. All remaining German POWs in Soviet-designated zones must be transferred immediately. No more delays. No more exceptions. 3 trains waited on a rail siding, engines steaming in the summer heat. Soviet liaison officers stood on the platform, clipboards in hand, ready to receive their prisoners. Inside the camp, over 200 women had barricaded themselves inside their barracks. British military police surrounded the building. A loudspeaker crackled to life. The order was repeated in German. Assemble for transport within 1 hour, or force would be used. The women did not move. Inside, they had pushed bunks against the doors. Some knelt in prayer. Others sat in silence, arms linked. A few had smuggled razors, prepared to open their wrists rather than board those trains. The camp commander, a colonel named Richard Hastings, stood outside the barracks. He was 46 years old, a veteran of North Africa and Normandy. He had seen men die screaming in burning tanks. He had walked through the ruins of Falaise. He thought he understood the cost of war. But this was different. He ordered the loudspeaker shut off. He approached the barracks door alone. "I am coming in," he called in halting German. "I am unarmed. I want to talk." After a long silence, the door opened a crack. He stepped inside. The women watched him. Hollow eyes, sunken cheeks, bodies worn down by months of uncertainty. One of them, an older woman who had served as a Wehrmacht nurse, spoke for the group. "We know what happens in the East, Colonel. We have heard the stories. We have seen the refugees. If you put us on those trains, you are sending us to our deaths." Hastings had no answer that satisfied him. He knew the reports. British intelligence had documented widespread sexual violence in Soviet-occupied territories. The evidence was undeniable. But so were his orders. "I have no authority to change this," he said quietly. The nurse stepped closer. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled. "Then you are no different than we were, following orders, sending people to death because someone higher up commanded it." The words hit like a slap. Hastings left the barracks without another word. Outside, the Soviet liaison officers were growing impatient. The trains had schedules. Delays created diplomatic incidents. Moscow was watching. Hastings radioed his superiors. He requested permission to delay the transport pending further review. The response came back within the hour. Negative. Orders stand. Proceed immediately. He looked at his men, young soldiers who had fought their way across Europe, who had liberated camps, who had seen what tyranny looked like. Now they were being asked to drag women by force onto trains heading east. Some of the soldiers refused. A sergeant named William Green stepped forward. "Sir, I didn't fight this war to do this." "I can't." Hastings could have him court-martialed. Instead, he reassigned him to the perimeter. 3 other soldiers followed Green's lead. They were quietly moved to other duties, but there weren't enough conscientious objectors to stop what came next. At 1400 hours, military police entered the barracks. The women who could walk were pulled to their feet. Those who resisted were carried. Those who tried to harm themselves had the blades taken from their hands. They were loaded onto trucks and driven to the rail siding. Some wept silently. Others screamed. A few went catatonic, staring at nothing as they were placed on the train cars. The Soviet officers checked names against their lists, efficient and emotionless. But not all the women made it onto the trains. In the chaos of loading, 37 women simply vanished. Guards later reported confusion, miscounts, administrative errors. Hastings filed the incident reports himself, his handwriting unusually difficult to read. Those 37 women were quietly transferred to camps in the British-controlled western zones, their papers lost in the shuffle. It was a small act of defiance, insignificant in the scope of history. But for those 37 women, it was everything. The trains departed on schedule. The Soviet officers signed the transfer documents, satisfied. The diplomatic protocol had been followed. Inside the camp, Hastings stood alone in the empty barracks, bunks still pushed against doors, a forgotten prayer book on the floor. A scrap of paper with a woman's name, Anna, written over and over in pencil. He picked it up, folded it carefully, and placed it in his pocket. Years later, after the Cold War had calcified and the archives began to open, researchers would discover his private letters. In one, written to his wife 3 days after the transport, he confessed, "I followed my orders today. I am not proud of it. I do not know if I can forgive myself, but I saved who I could. God help me, I saved who I could." The trains rolled east into the Soviet zone. What happened to the women aboard would remain largely unknown for decades. The trains arrived at Soviet processing centers near the border between the British and Soviet zones. What followed was documented only in fragments. Soviet records remained classified for decades, and many who experienced it did not survive to testify. Some women were sent directly to labor camps, facilities in the Ural Mountains, Siberia, Kazakhstan, places where German POWs, both male and female, were put to work in mines, factories, and construction projects. Conditions were brutal. Rations were minimal. Disease was rampant. Thousands died in the first winter. Others were held in filtration camps, grim facilities where Soviet intelligence officers interrogated prisoners for intelligence value and screened for war criminals. The interrogations were harsh. Some women were accused of espionage, collaboration beyond their documented roles, or sabotage. Confessions were extracted through sleep deprivation, beatings, and psychological torture. Sexual violence was systematic. Reports from survivors who eventually returned to Germany in the 1950s described a culture of impunity. Officers and guards treated German women as spoils of war, a form of revenge for the atrocities committed during the Wehrmacht's invasion of the Soviet Union. A woman named Margarete, captured near Berlin and repatriated in 1948, later gave testimony to West German authorities. She had served as a typist in a Wehrmacht supply depot, a non-combatant role. After being turned over to Soviet forces, she spent 3 years in a camp near Magnitogorsk. "We worked 14 hours a day in the factories," she recounted. "At night, there was no safety. The guards came when they wanted. We learned not to resist. Resistance meant death, or worse, being sent to the isolation cells where you would freeze or starve." Of the approximately 8,000 German women handed over to Soviet authorities in the summer of 1945, fewer than half returned alive. Some died of typhus, dysentery, or malnutrition. Others succumbed to the cold, the labor, or despair. A significant number simply disappeared into the vast Soviet penal system, their fates unrecorded. The women who had been lost in the administrative confusion. Those 37 Colonel Hastings had quietly saved, fared differently. They remained in British-controlled camps through late 1945 and into 1946 as the occupation solidified, policies shifted. The fervor for immediate repatriation cooled. The emerging Cold War tensions made the Western Allies less willing to cooperate unconditionally with Soviet demands. These women were eventually released into the British zone of occupied Germany. They were required to register with local authorities, prohibited from certain types of employment, and monitored for potential security risks. But they were alive. They were not in Siberia. Some rebuilt lives in the ruins of post-war Germany. Others emigrated using false papers, marriage, or refugee programs to Britain, the United States, South America. Their silence was profound. For decades, they did not speak of what had happened. The women who survived Soviet captivity returned to a Germany that did not want to hear their stories. In the East, under communist rule, any narrative of Soviet brutality was forbidden. In the West, the focus was on rebuilding, on the Marshall Plan, on forgetting the complexities of the war in favor of a cleaner narrative. Nazi Germany had been evil. The Allies had been liberators. Justice had been served. The women who had refused repatriation, who had begged not to be sent east, did not fit that narrative. They were reminders of uncomfortable truths, that the Allied victory had required morally ambiguous compromises, that liberation for some had meant suffering for others, that the line between victim and perpetrator was never as clear as the history books suggested. Many married quickly, changed their names, and disappeared into ordinary post-war lives. They worked in shops, raised children, kept their Wehrmacht service records hidden in attics, or burned them entirely. A few, tormented by survivors' guilt or the weight of silence, took their own lives in the years that followed. The Allied commanders, who had overseen the repatriations, also carried the burden quietly. Colonel Hastings retired from the Army in 1952. He never spoke publicly about the events of June 1945, but his family later found journals filled with sleepless reflections. "I wonder," he wrote in 1958, "if the women I sent east curse my name in whatever cold place they ended. I wonder if the ones I saved ever knew how close they came to the same fate. I wonder if any of it mattered." Other officers who had followed orders without deviation expressed no such doubts. They had done their duty within the framework of international agreements. The moral weight, they argued, belonged to policymakers, not soldiers, but the policies themselves began to shift. By 1947, as the Cold War calcified and the Soviet Union transitioned from ally to adversary, Western governments quietly revised their approach to repatriation. Forced returns to Soviet-controlled territories largely ceased. Refugees and displaced persons were given more agency in determining their futures. It was too late for the women sent east in 1945. In the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, archives began to open. Researchers uncovered records of the filtration camps, the labor battalions, the death rates among German POWs. Survivor testimonies were finally published. Documentaries were made. Historians began to grapple with the full scope of what had occurred. The story of the women who refused to leave, who begged Allied commanders not to send them east, emerged as a footnote in larger histories of the war's end. But for those who lived it, it was never a footnote. It was the moment their survival hung on the decision of a foreign officer. The chaos of a moment, the mercy or indifference of a guard who might look the other way. Some were saved, most were not, and the reason they refused to leave, fear of annihilation at the hands of an army seeking vengeance for unspeakable crimes, stunned commanders, because it forced them to confront a truth they could not reconcile, that victory and justice are not always the same thing. The story of these women exists in the shadows of World War II's end, a place where moral clarity dissolves into gray. History prefers clean narratives. The Allies liberated Europe. The Nazis were defeated. Justice was served. But between the headlines and the monuments, there are countless moments like the one in that camp outside Hanover. Moments that defy simple categorization. These women had served a regime responsible for genocide, for industrialized murder, for a war that consumed 50 million lives. Some had committed atrocities themselves. Others had merely typed reports, operated radios, or served food in military canteens. The uniforms they wore connected them to crimes beyond comprehension. But they were also human beings, capable of fear, of suffering, of pleading for mercy. And the men who held their fates in their hands, Allied commanders who had fought to destroy fascism, found themselves complicit in a different kind of cruelty. Not through malice, but through the cold mechanics of geopolitics, treaty obligations, and the impossible arithmetic of justice after total war. What does it mean to win a war morally when the peace requires moral compromise? The women who refused to leave understood something their captors were only beginning to grasp: that the end of the war had not ended the violence. It had merely redirected it. The vengeance that swept through Eastern Europe in 1945 was not random. It was the echo of barbarism repaid, a wound so deep that mercy seemed like betrayal to the dead. But vengeance is not justice, and justice that becomes indistinguishable from vengeance loses its meaning. The commanders who saved a few, who lost paperwork or delayed trains, were not heroes. They were men caught between impossible choices, doing what little they could within the constraints of duty. The ones who followed orders without deviation were not monsters. They were soldiers in a system that demanded compliance, even when compliance required them to ignore their own consciences. War creates these moral traps. It forces ordinary people into situations where every choice is a betrayal of something. Duty, compassion, justice, mercy. The women who refused to leave, who stood in those barracks knowing they might be dragged onto trains at gunpoint, were not symbols. They were individuals with names, families, fears, and pasts more complicated than any single narrative can contain. Their story matters not because it absolves anyone, but because it reveals the human cost of ideological absolutes. It reminds us that history is lived by people, not by nations or movements, and that the end of a war does not mean the end of suffering. Sometimes, it is only the beginning of a different kind. 70 years later, the barracks are gone. The camps have been paved over or returned to farmland. The women who survived have mostly passed away. Their testimonies preserved in archives few will read. But the question they forced their captors to confront remains. When does duty become complicity? When does justice become cruelty? And who decides? There are no easy answers. There never were. Only the cold fact that in the spring of 1945, women stood behind barbed wire and refused freedom, because they understood that sometimes captivity is safer than liberation. And that truth, uncomfortable, undeniable, is one history must not forget.